At a gas station outside Houston, nothing looks broken. The pumps still work. The freeway is still full. The coffee inside still costs about what it did last week. And that is exactly why this kind of shock is dangerous. Because when Americans hear about war in the Middle East, many still imagine the old movie version of an oil crisis. Empty stations, panic lines, a sudden national shortage. But that is usually not how the first damage shows up now. If the Iran war keeps dragging on, the first thing that may break in the U.S. economy is not the physical flow of gasoline into your town. It is the price system around everyday life. It is the fragile belief that inflation was cooling, that rate cuts were coming, that households were finally about to breathe again. That is the real story here. Not whether America runs out of oil tomorrow, but whether a longer war turns energy into a new inflation engine, whether it delays relief from the Fed, weakens confidence, and starts cracking growth from the outside in. This matters right now because the market is already reacting as if the conflict is no longer just a short headline shock. Oil has already surged. Shipping disruption around the Strait of Hormuz has become a serious concern. Gasoline prices in the United States are moving higher again, and that matters because the American economy was already in a delicate place. Consumers were tired. Rate-sensitive parts of the economy were still under pressure. Markets were watching for proof that inflation would keep easing enough for policy to become less restrictive. A sustained energy shock threatens that whole setup. So this is not just a foreign policy story. It is a kitchen table economic story. It reaches the gas station first, then shipping, then airline costs, then business margins, then household sentiment, then the Fed, and eventually the growth outlook itself. The real question is not whether the war matters. The real question is where the crack appears first. The first thing to understand is that the United States is not the old America of the 1970s. It produces far more oil at home than it once did, and it is far less directly dependent on Gulf crude than in earlier decades. That is the good news. The bad news is that oil is still priced in a global market. So even if America is less dependent on Middle Eastern barrels physically, it is still exposed financially. If a conflict squeezes a choke point that carries a major share of globally traded oil and gas, prices can jump everywhere, including in the United States. That is why the first stage of the shock is usually a price shock, not a shortage shock. And that is exactly why this matters for America. The first thing likely to break is not supply availability at the pump. It is the soft landing narrative. It is the assumption that inflation keeps cooling, consumers keep spending, and the Fed can gradually step back. That is the story now under pressure. The mechanism starts with oil, but does not stay there. Higher crude pushes up gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and a long list of transportation-linked costs. Diesel matters especially because it touches freight, logistics, farming, construction, and industrial distribution. So the shock does not remain trapped inside the energy sector. It begins to leak into the cost structure of the broader economy. Then it hits inflation. Even if the effect on core inflation is weaker than on headline inflation, households and markets react very quickly to visible energy costs. And that is where psychology becomes as important as arithmetic. Most people do not track Brent crude every day, but they know exactly what it costs to fill the tank. They know when shipping feels more expensive. They know when airline tickets move higher. So when fuel rises again, people start feeling that inflation is not truly gone. They become more cautious. They spend more defensively. Businesses become less confident. Markets start rethinking the path of interest rates. That is where the Fed problem appears. A supply-side oil shock is awkward for monetary policy. Higher rates do not create more oil, but ignoring the shock becomes harder if headline inflation starts rising again, or if inflation expectations begin to drift upward. That means the Fed can get stuck in the worst kind of position, unable to fix the source of the problem, but less free to ease policy. And once that happens, the growth story becomes weaker. Higher energy costs act like a tax on households and businesses. Margins get squeezed. Discretionary spending softens. Transportation-heavy sectors come under pressure. If markets fall at the same time, the wealth effect can make the slowdown even worse. So the chain is simple. War pressure becomes oil pressure. Oil pressure becomes fuel pressure. Fuel pressure becomes inflation pressure. Inflation pressure becomes Fed pressure. Fed pressure becomes growth pressure. That is why the first break is not a dramatic shortage. It is a slower but more dangerous fracture. A fracture in the disinflation growth balance the U.S. economy was trying to hold together. For regular Americans, the first visible sign is simple. Filling up the car gets painful again. That matters not only for commuters, but for delivery workers, small contractors, rideshare drivers, and families whose budgets are already stretched. And the damage never stays limited to the pump. If diesel stays elevated, shipping becomes more expensive. That pressures food distribution, retail logistics, and local business costs. If jet fuel stays expensive, travel gets hit. If businesses cannot fully pass costs along, margins shrink. If they do pass them along, consumers feel it across more categories. Either way, households lose. The second layer is interest rates. Even if the Fed does not hike, it may have less room to cut. And for households hoping for relief on credit cards, auto loans, small business loans, or housing affordability, a delayed easing cycle still hurts. The effect may not feel dramatic in one day, but over months, it adds up. Then comes confidence. When fuel rises, markets wobble, and headlines get darker, people become more defensive. They postpone purchases. They cut optional spending. They start treating every paycheck more like a shield than a launch pad. That is how an external war can begin weakening domestic growth without ever producing a classic American shortage scene. The common pushback is obvious. America produces plenty of oil now. This is not the 1970s, so the U.S. economy can handle it. That argument is half true. Yes, America is much more energy resilient than it used to be. Domestic output is high, and direct dependence on Gulf imports is much lower than in earlier decades. That absolutely reduces the risk of a pure physical supply collapse inside the United States. But that does not make America immune, because the real question is not only where the molecules come from, it is where the price is set, and the price is still global. If disruption around Hormuz drives a worldwide repricing of oil, American consumers and businesses still feel it. So the better way to think about this is simple. America is safer from a literal shortage than many countries, but it is not safe from a global energy price shock and the inflation growth trade-off that comes with it. From here, there are three realistic scenarios. In the first, the conflict stays hot but limited, and shipping disruption gradually improves. In that case, the United States probably absorbs a temporary inflation spike, some pressure on confidence, and a modest hit to growth, but avoids deeper damage. In the second scenario, the war drags on, and Hormuz remains unstable or partially impaired. That is where the U.S. economy starts feeling a more serious squeeze. Higher gas and diesel prices, firmer headline inflation, fewer or later rate cuts, softer spending, and slower growth. In the third scenario, the disruption worsens sharply, and energy markets stop believing in near-term normalization. That is when the first crack in the U.S. economy could widen from delayed inflation relief into something uglier. A broader slowdown driven by weak confidence, squeezed real incomes, and tighter financial conditions. So what breaks first if the Iran war drags on? Probably not the gas station itself. Probably not the physical availability of fuel in the old cinematic sense. What breaks first is the story America was telling itself. That inflation was on the way down. That relief was coming. And that growth could keep limping forward without a new external shock. If that story breaks, the rest of the economy gets much harder to stabilize.
However, these warm cracks indicate underlying pressures we need to watch. Our analysis suggests that growth will continue to limp forward, provided there are no new external shocks. Once the story breaks, the whole economy becomes harder to stabilize.